So, welcome everybody to the second of our Gender Studies lecture series this fall. I am Dr. Karen Reeder. I teach in Religious Studies, and I'm also one of the coordinators for the Gender Studies minor. If you want to know more, let me know. Be happy to talk to you about that. The Gender Studies lecture series is an interdisciplinary lecture series that brings together faculty from across campus to present on issues and concepts and questions related to the central concern of gender. Tonight is our second lecture of the semester, and we're very pleased to have Dr. Erin Sizer presenting this evening. Dr. Sizer is a graduate of a very prestigious undergraduate institution. You may know it. It's called Westmont College. He earned a Master's of Divinity and a doctorate in church history from Princeton University, which is an okay school as well. He researches the church in America, particularly mainline Protestant traditions, and he's very interested, as you can tell from this lovely poster, in issues of gender and how that relates to our experience of the church. He's one of the directors of the Gady Institute here at Westmont. He's speaking tonight on Re-Masculinizing Christianity, Gender and Religious Change in the Progressive Era. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sizer.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thanks, Dr. Reeder, for that nice introduction. This is plainly false advertising. We are not getting all the way up to the year when this painting was painted in my remarks tonight. Anybody have a guess when this was painted? A little bit later than that, 1999. And if you were born at the time that I was, you would recognize this as a 1999 painting any day of the week. So unfortunately, I'll have to leave you to process this imagery in your gender studies classes. I thought we just needed something at the top this evening to inspire us to strap on our boxing gloves of mercy before we get going. As I prepared this lecture, I kept thinking about a fleeting encounter that I recently had with the world of fashion. I've never owned a flannel shirt, and as morning temperatures in my house have dipped into the low 60s, I know, burr, I found myself wanting more flannel in my life. I poked around at Land's End, but the dorky daddishness was a little hard to bear, even for this dorky dad. If you want the evocative hard sell, I learned, you have to visit sites like this one. This is Huckberry, where buying a flannel shirt becomes a visual poem of masculinity. They sell shirts like this one, the Texas-made flannel, by a brand called Flint and Tinder. Here's the Maritime shirt jacket. This one's the flannel-lined trucker. Here's the Army Everyday Oxford, which is an interesting constellation of words. And just to be gratuitous, here's a guy with a falcon selling a wristwatch. And here's his tugboat. And here, I suppose, is where he lives. These are all actual pictures from the site. These products, I learned, are part of a trend called workwear, popular for about the last 10 years. Workwear, to my untrained ear, sounded like any clothes you might wear to the office, or maybe special clothes for particular kinds of hard work involving, say, hammers or steel girders. But the reality turns out to be smack in the middle. Workwear, I think we can say, is steel girder clothing for the MacBook laborer. Clothes to make you feel like a logger or a sea captain as you head off to do your job as a graphic designer. On the one hand, who can account for fashion? But it's hard not to notice that at a moment when most middle-class American men find themselves poking at a laptop from 9 to 5, men's fashion is all Flint, Tinder, boats, and trucks. There seems to be an inverse relationship between what middle-class men actually do for a living and how they present themselves, trading in emblems of masculinity that are equal parts vanished history, ennui, and irony. I'm not a gender historian or theorist, but even I can get my head around this symbol of how free-floating our ideas about men and women have become, how little they're related to the roles we have or the work we do, how much they're spun from something like pure nostalgia. Something like this phenomenon is as old as post-industrialism, and Americans in the late 19th century found themselves in a similar place. As the site of their work moved from fields to factories, then factories to offices, their ideas about gender also underwent dramatic change. Tonight I'd like to trace a small part of that story, to examine how masculinity starts to move in the late 19th century and how that movement shapes American Protestantism. My destination will be the Northern Presbyterian Church, a large, wealthy, and prominent denomination that experienced these developments acutely. They contributed significantly to a schism in the 1930s, part of the fundamentalist modernist controversies. They also launched Presbyterian women on an institutional roller coaster ride that resulted eventually in women's ordination. So Presbyterians will be our case study in the latter half or so of this lecture. Before we get there, though, I want to think at some length about the large-scale changes in which Presbyterians were participating. The United States, through most of the 19th century, was joined to England in an ever-expanding transatlantic industrial enterprise, anchored in textile production. The terms of that relationship changed throughout the century as the new American nation built from scratch an integrated economy that had been basically suppressed under British rule. It changed especially after the huge acceleration in industrial production that accompanied the American Civil War. In general, though, to be a man in the Victorian era was to be increasingly drawn into the global industrial capitalist enterprise, in the worlds of labor, administration, or finance. By modern standards, of course, manufacturing in the in the 19th century was highly unregulated. And unlike global capitalism in our own day, which for the most part manages to keep the worst inequities of the system out of view of the wealthiest people, industrial exploitation in the Victorian era was in your face, regardless of your wealth or status. In burgeoning English urban centers, there was no escaping the physical brutality of the factory or the poverty that accompanied it. On the other side of the Atlantic, exploitation of human labor was manifest in the institution of slavery, essential to the production of cotton, the most important raw material in the Atlantic industrial machine. Britons and Americans were under few illusions then about the bare-knuckled quality of capitalism. The world of work was a nasty place. This phase of Atlantic industrialization obviously produced some major moral critiques, and we'll get to those in a moment. We might think that most people, though, did not become radical abolitionists or labor organizers, but rather made the psychological adjustments necessary to live with a clear conscience in an exploitative system. One major adjustment hinged on gender ideology and involved a narrative that went something like this. In the Victorian imagination, men, whether rich or poor, ventured forth from their homes every day to contend in the unforgiving, sin-encrusted world of industrial capitalism. To survive in this world took nerve and resilience. It also took a certain moral flexibility, or even callousness, the ability to stomach the manifest miseries of a system that ground human beings in its gears. But even in this darkness, there was salvation. According to this narrative, as men rode each day into a hard-scrabble world of moral compromises, women too set about their proper work, putting aright the home, a space increasingly separate and distant from the world of work. This involved more than cleaning the house and minding the children. Women performed a kind of moral purgation of the space they controlled, sweeping not just the soot, but also the moral stain from the home. The heart of women's work, toward which all the ordinary tasks of their lives were bent, was to create and preserve a sanctuary from the world. In pedestrian terms, this sanctuary was for their children, who required a designated shelter until they came of age. It was also for their husbands, for whom the domestic space was a safe harbor. It's not much of a stretch, though, to see the Victorian home as a sanctuary for Christian civilization itself. The one place, as industrial capitalism corroded whatever morality it touched, where the basic value systems of the Christian West would be maintained. This was a pretty tall order, to balance the world's gathering darkness in perfect counterpoise. And it required women not only to be good and industrious in the management of their households, but indeed to be saints. So much was corruption in industrial Britain and later America that Victorian society needed assurance that some things were still unblemished. The sacred space of home, the sacred feminine figure who preserved it. This was the so-called doctrine of separate spheres, and it was, of course, a complete myth. Victorian homes, we might think, had just as many broken dishes and tantruming 3-year-olds as any home today. And this gender division of space and work, we'll be quick to notice, was available only to the wealthiest families who could afford to keep the sanctuary staffed at all times. But if the binary division between moral domestic femininity and pragmatic public masculinity was a myth, it was a supremely useful myth. It shaped, first of all, the real opportunities available to women as the 19th century progressed. True, women's work was rather crisply defined as preserving the sanctity of the domestic space. But how and where that space should be defended was a real question. The domestic sphere was strengthened when mothers kept their children out of mischief and taught them to recite the catechism. It was likewise strengthened when women opposed the many social ills that threatened the home from without. American slavery in its antebellum phase, for instance, was notoriously destructive of family structures, as wives, husbands, and children were sold arbitrarily to fill the voracious labor needs of an expanding cotton kingdom. In addition to this ruthless geographical dislocation, masters, in seeking to prevent rebellion, often curtailed or forbade among slaves those practices most essential to respectable Victorian notions of home: legal marriage, education, and free practice of the Christian faith. Whatever other reasons Northern women might have had for opposing slavery then, they could do so quite legitimately on the ground that slaveholding violated the domestic space for which women were seen to be responsible. Or take alcohol. The saloon represented a kind of liminal zone, a place literally between work and home that transformed men from dutiful husbands and fathers into rampaging beasts. The saloon took men physically away from their appointed role in the home, that is, to undergird it with authority, rationality, and order. But more than that, alcohol robbed masculinity of its proper virtues, turning men into pathetic, irrational agents of discord. Women who ventured into the public sphere to promote temperance and prohibition then could do so under good ideological cover. They had every right to attack at the source the evil that men had been tracking from the saloons into their homes. We'll not be surprised that these two great moral campaigns shared a lot of personnel. They also overlapped substantially with the campaign for women's suffrage. Though that effort finally succeeded only in 1920, as Victorian gender ideology was waning, it depended directly on successes women had had in the previous century in proving the case for the public defense of private moral virtue. Even as 19th century women activists were approaching their greatest victories, the ground of gender was moving under their feet. For one thing, economic forces again conspired to change people's relationship to the world of work. A corporatizing capitalism meant that increasingly men from the expanding middle classes were insulated from the physicality of industry. They were unlikely to be in the vicinity of someone swinging a hammer, and almost certainly weren't swinging that hammer themselves. One possible reaction was to redefine masculinity to valorize these legions of men in suits. We'll see that in a few minutes when we turn to talk about the Presbyterian case. But that reaction wasn't necessarily incompatible with a more basic discomfort with this corporate relocation of work. The fire-breathing dragon of the factory was exchanged for the enervating miasma of the office. Men sitting all day at their desks were in less danger of becoming monsters than listless weaklings. Those who were swinging hammers need some mention too. Huge influxes of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe after 1870 flooded American industry with laborers who looked, spoke, and believed, many were Catholic or Jewish, differently from old stock Americans. At the same time, the growing affluence of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants translated into a sharp reduction in the birth rate. So if one were inclined in, say, 1900 to be fearful or resentful of immigrants, one couldn't help notice that they had much larger families and much stronger arms. These immigrants were pouring into a country that, for perhaps the first time, had come to seem finite in geographical space. The Census Bureau in 1890 had declared the frontier closed. That is, there was no longer a line beyond which average population density was less than 2 people per square mile. As America became ever more urban, and urban centers more crowded with poor polyglot working communities, many came to feel that the country had been sealed in to stew in its own unsavory juices. Or to take it further, that the nation was becoming a Malthusian pressure cooker, soon to explode in an all-out war for what had recently been revealed to be finite resources. The growing distance from the Civil War compounded this uneasiness. For generations of men who came of age after the middle of the 1880s, their mettle had never been tested in battle. With corporate drudgery sapping their manhood and menacing foreigners gaining strength, there was no evidence that young white Protestant men would, even by force of arms, be able to hold the world together. These were some of the origins of the lurch toward masculine assertiveness that began in America in the last decades of the 19th century and continued well into the 20th. The relocation of work from the farm to the factory to the office, the rapid growth of a very alien-seeming immigrant population, and fears tied to a declining white birth rate, a closed frontier, and decades of relative peace. This masculine moment, as I'll call it, produced a colorful array of phenomena. One of these was a new appetite for imperialistic military adventuring, seen most vividly in the United States' pugnacious prosecution of war with Spain in 1898, a patently unnecessary conflict sold to the American public with the thinnest possible justification. Militarism got another boost in the First World War, a conflict I'll return to later. On the other side of the coin, you saw increasing talk of race suicide. That is, the racist fear that Anglo-Saxons, faced with the challenge of a vigorous new immigrant population, were simply folding, failing to compete against allegedly inferior peoples who, in their native urban habitat, multiplied like vermin. Perhaps more benignly, this period produced a tremendous uptick in the popularity of outdoor physical activity. One of the great medical fears of the late 19th century was neurasthenia, a medicalization of the absence of physicality in modern life. It was thought that people who worked in offices all day, not with the land or animals or machines, but rather with numbers and words and ideas, were in danger of becoming, quote, excessively cultivated, feeding their brains at the expense of their bodies and thereby becoming stressed out, anxious, and chronically tired. The man who named this disease, George Beard, associated it particularly with the weakness of the female brain, but the diagnosis was often made of men as well, again raising the specter of feminization. One way to combat this softening was through sports, which, in addition to strengthening muscles weakened by long hours at a desk, also usefully ritualized conflict, rehearsing and channeling aggression. Fears of over-civilization also propelled men and boys, and secondarily women and families, into the outdoors. The Boy Scouts of America was founded in 1910, the National Park System in 1916. Many of these articulations of masculinity came together in the person of the 26th President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt. Though he would later become the very picture of roughly assertive masculinity, Roosevelt was a weak and sickly child, a dandified and refined young professional, and a diagnosed neurasthenic. Especially for women, the usual treatment for neurasthenia was the rest cure, confining oneself to bed for an extended period to restore one's shattered nerves. By the time Roosevelt was being treated, though, an alternative had emerged, not the rest cure, but the West cure. Doctors' orders to head into the wild, live on a ranch, rope cattle, ford rivers, and generally be tough and rugged. For Roosevelt, the cure worked, and then some. Here he is with the pioneering naturalist John Muir at Glacier Point in Yosemite. Crediting the great Western outdoors for his recovery, Roosevelt would become the nation's most prominent politician conservationist. And that same spirit of strenuous masculinity animated his attitude about armed conflict. Whatever else war might accomplish, Roosevelt believed, it was inherently valuable as an opportunity to practice the manly art of courageous exertion. When he led a volunteer band of Rough Riders in the fight against Spain in Cuba, Roosevelt believed himself to be advancing the march of American civilization over against an inferior power, but also showing the value of the strenuous life, belligerence as a path to self-improvement. We could say more about the features of this turn-of-the-century masculine reaction in the larger culture. Physical education in public school had its origins in this period. So do efforts to build urban play spaces for children. So does the arts and crafts movement in architecture and visual art, which emphasize connection to the natural world and the deeply physical expertise of the craftsman. But I want to turn attention now to the ways this chord sounded in the American church. Some of these basically paralleled the larger enthusiasm for all things strenuous. Christian conversion in the high Victorian era, as well as the revival preaching that incited it, had generally emphasized submissiveness and relinquishment. Toward the end of the 19th century, the most prominent American evangelists changed their tone and their message, offering more assertive models for coming to Christ. Some of this had to do with the underlying long-term trend in theology away from strict Calvinist insistence on human depravity and toward human ability. In the later 19th century, this trend was most visible in holiness and victorious life movements, which espoused highly optimistic positions on the human ability to triumph over sin. Coming to Christ could be an empowering act, one that would propel the believer into a life triumphant. The ministry of Dwight L. Moody, who's right here, is a good example of the growing mainstream appeal of these theologies. On the other side of the theological aisle, social gospelers, who believed Christ's modern call to the church was preeminently to serve the urban poor, also rode the masculinizing wave. Though it was in many ways continuous with urban social work that had been and would continue to be done by women, the social gospel was often cast in terms of heroic, manly exertion, drawing especially on the image of Christ as a working man, a carpenter who was quick to act, rather than dithering about in theological speculation. Or consider two other very visible expressions of turn-of-the-century urban Protestantism. Many historians have noted that the architecture of urban churches built in this period projected a kind of exaggerated solidity, often mimicking medieval fortresses. Here's Bethany Presbyterian in Philadelphia, a church I'll mention again in just a moment. Here are a couple more examples of the style. By the way, there's one church in Santa Barbara that comes to mind that has this style of architecture. Is it familiar to you? Any guesses? Trinity Episcopal.
Yeah.
So here it is, here on the corner of State and Mickle-Turena, complete with battlements and little window slits for the archers to shoot through, I suppose. We can easily imagine this architecture as a cultural and political statement. A claim to the centrality of old-line Protestantism, perhaps, a nostalgic gesture conjuring up a simpler and more honorable time, a comment about the church's posture over against the roiling urban landscape, maybe a kind of implicit warning to poor and non-Protestant communities. Or finally, think of the Young Men's Christian Association. The YMCA wasn't founded as an athletic organization, but rather a provider of religious and social services to urban laborers. Swimming pools and gyms came in several decades later, in the 1870s and 1880s, along with a new mission statement, quote, "the improvement of the spiritual, mental, social, and physical condition of young men," end quote. It was quintessentially in the YMCAs that a strain of religion known as muscular Christianity was advanced, starting in the closing decades of the 19th century. Dyed-in-the-wool muscular Christians advocated an explicit linkage of Christianity and sports, not only because athletic activity would keep young men off the streets and out of trouble, but because sports supposedly revivified the Christian spirit. These expressions of strenuous urban Protestantism, aggressive evangelism emphasizing victory and power, social gospel service to the city's poor, a fortress aesthetic, and muscular Christianity combined in interesting ways. Returning to Bethany Church in Philadelphia, this wasn't merely a massive Protestant fortress against the corruption of the downtown city, but rather a leading institutional church, not institutional church in the way we usually mean it, but in a specialized sense. That is to say, a church that was a house of worship, a community center, and social service provider for the urban poor, all rolled into one massive operation. Bethany had the largest Sunday school program in the nation aimed at Americanizing immigrant children. This is the meeting hall of their Sunday school. The church also ran a vocational college for adults, sports facilities, and a health clinic. It was a hive of activity every day of the week. So here's a church embodying Protestant strength in the inner city, and also taking up with deepest seriousness the paternalistic burden of the social gospel toward the immigrant poor in their midst. Another intriguing combination of masculine forces was evident in the ministry of Billy Sunday, the early 20th century's most famous evangelist. Sunday's style drew on his earlier career as a professional baseball player, leaping about on stage, pretending to hit home runs for Christ, and boxing the devil. Sunday inveighed against what he saw as limp, emasculated faith, against, quote, off-handed, flabby-cheeked, brittle-boned, weak-kneed, thin-skinned, pliable, plastic, spineless, effeminate, ossified, three-carat Christianity. He had lots of those kinds of phrases in his arsenal. Sunday represents a remarkably successful and seamless fusion of evangelism with an emerging sports culture. His ministry, of course, would not be the last to trade on that alliance. All of this is to suggest just some of the many ways that this masculine moment reverberated through the American church. As in the general culture, these Christian attempts at re-masculinization had very much to do with economic change, with urbanization, with the ascent of the middle class, and with new immigration patterns. But the church had its own anxieties around questions of gender, the most obvious of which emerged from a basic imbalance in its membership. In some communities, the male-female participation gap was positively huge, with women outnumbering men in the pews by a ratio of 9-1. Faced with this statistic, we might wonder whether Victorian attitudes about gender and moral custodianship didn't constitute a kind of self-fulfilling vision. Tell men that the church and its values are the special preserve of women, and men, feeling unburdened of their duties, will head toward the exits. Indeed, church was often regarded in the Victorian era as a place where women were indigenous and men exotic. Just like children, husbands had to be dragged to church by the hand. But even in denominations where membership was closer to parity, it's fair to say that men and women occupied notably different spaces in the church, and those spaces came increasingly to conflict. Here I want to finally turn to the American Presbyterian case, where we'll stay for the rest of our time tonight. By the turn of the 20th century, this once scrappy Scottish immigrant church was on the cusp of a kind of golden age, both in terms of membership, which would advance steadily for the first 65 years of the new century, and in terms of political influence. True, they had begun losing to new immigrant groups, notably Catholics, in their percent share of the American religious marketplace. Nevertheless, Presbyterians at the turn of the century believed they were on their way up and on their way in to the most privileged centers of cultural power. This is the Witherspoon Building, their main administrative center in Philadelphia. These aspirations, as well as a growing anxiety about their ability to maintain the upward trend, would be defining features of Presbyterians' encounter with the masculine moment. But before we get there, we need to back up a few years to think about the denomination's 19th century features. Presbyterian institutional complexity grew throughout the century, but never faster than after the Civil War. As the nation pieced itself back together and reestablished its economy on freshly industrial footing, the world opened up to American missionaries. Many missionary opportunities were abroad. Presbyterians had a particularly strong presence in China. Many were also at home, to newly freed former slaves, to the urban poor, to specialized workers like miners and lumberjacks. To meet those needs, Presbyterians expanded their infrastructure at a breakneck pace. A forest of agencies and benevolent boards sprang up practically overnight after 1870. It was here, in this welter of new missionary ventures, that Presbyterian women found their largest leadership opportunities to date. Growing from grassroots female sent societies, Presbyterian women's missionary boards by the end of the 19th century had become big business. That business was primarily raising and directing missionary support funds. By 1890, just one of the two women's boards was bringing in more mission dollars than all individual Presbyterian congregations combined. Moreover, as historian Dana Robert has explored, missionary field work opened many new doors for women for reasons of practical necessity. Whatever the Apostle Paul might have had to say about the circumstances in which women could or could not teach, the mission field demanded all hands on deck. Not only because personnel was limited, but because local custom often restricted male missionaries' access to potential female converts. This, again, was work that could fairly easily be ratified by Victorian gender ideology. Missionary work was as educational as it was theological, as domestic as it was public. And if that work sometimes pulled women into quite visible roles as missionaries or as executives of missionary boards, These activities could be construed, as in the case of female activists against slavery and alcohol, as extensions of Victorian motherhood. On the other hand, as the full significance of women's success in missionary endeavor dawned on the male denominational leadership, tensions began to surface. Presbyterian top brass became increasingly suspicious of semi-independent women's boards, which were necessary to keep the missionary machine humming, but not subject to strict central control. In the 19th century and continuing well into the 20th, the almost entirely unchallenged preserve of Presbyterian male leadership was not activism, missionary work, or even administration, it was theology. The pulpit, of course, was the domain of an entirely male pastorate, yet congregational life, as it does today, necessarily brought men and women together into the work. The training ground of pastors, though, was male, top to bottom. Princeton Seminary, pictured here, which for more than a century stood as a bastion of conservative Reformed theology, set the pace. American Presbyterianism inherited from its Old World counterpart a profound seriousness about the details of Reformed theology. The genius of 19th century Princeton was to remake that 17th century Scottish heritage into a durable American synthesis. Westminster theology, plus moderate Enlightenment thought, plus just enough sensitivity to pietism to be respectable in revival-swept North America. Princeton Seminary was founded in 1812, and its earliest theological superstars, men like Archibald Alexander, Charles Hodge, and Samuel Miller, stamped on the institution an approach to theology that was supremely rational, not merely repeating the dry orthodoxies of the past, but proving them in the book of nature, as it were, in real, living human investigation. This was done through alliance with the philosophical tradition known as common sense realism, a school of thought that held, as the name suggests, that the world was basically comprehensible, and especially that human beings' native intellect, with an assist from their emotional faculties, could steer people everywhere and always to correct moral judgments. Compared with more skeptical kinds of Enlightenment thought then gaining currency in Europe, common sense realism was a confident and constructive philosophy. Alexander, Hodge, and Miller saw their work not as speculative adventuring into the mysteries of the universe, but as careful treatment of hard evidence, collected from Scripture and from nature, and sifted to produce indubitable judgments about God and the world. In the later 19th century, this theological enterprise faced stiff headwinds. Darwinian evolution and biblical higher criticism were but two examples of an intellectual culture that increasingly understood its work not as collecting evidence in a basically stable system, but rather advancing hypotheses about a world constantly in flux. Prefacing the fundamentalist modernist conflicts of the 20th century, the Princetonians responded to these challenges by tightening their hold on the evidence. A. Hodge and B.B. Warfield advanced a new understanding of Scripture that made it completely without error in its so-called original autographs, that is, in the manuscripts that came directly from the quills of the original biblical writers. This move, of course, put the Bible and biblical theology behind an impregnable historical wall. Hodge and Warfield didn't have access to those original autographs, which was too bad for them, but neither did their higher critical opponents. So no amount of tinkering that modern biblical scholars might do with redactors, sources, contexts, or anything else could ever really threaten this Bible, standing as it did beyond the reach of historians. Not incidentally, this move also protected the status of the Princeton theologians themselves, who against a rising tide of historicism could now defend the exclusive right of their priesthood to interpret sacred Scripture. Again, Presbyterian women, by and large, didn't challenge this male theological citadel. But the reactionary direction of Princeton's theology was nonetheless unwelcome to many women. Not only did the doctrine of inerrancy shore up male control of Presbyterian theology, it also undercut the more historical, contextual readings of Scripture on which women's growing role in the life and ministry of the church depended. Even from a fairly conservative point of view, Paul's prohibition in 1 Timothy against women speaking could be understood to leave the door open for women to take all kinds of roles in the contemporary church. But this required some nuances of historical understanding that put Paul's letters in a particular time and place inside a particular culture. Biblical inerrancy, in its explicit anti-historicism, foreclosed the more contextual readings on which women's leadership was coming to rely. As the new century approached, even Presbyterian women who had no aspirations to leadership had reason to feel excluded by emerging denominational priorities. If Victorians imagined religion to be the natural habitat of near-saintly women, the implication was that women's participation in the church could be taken for granted, and their religious needs basically ignored. In the analogies of an election night, women were the church's base. Their allegiance seemed guaranteed. Men were the swing votes, the real catch, the ones deserving of the church's attention and resources. As Peggy Bendroth has observed, this assumption was on full display in Presbyterian evangelistic efforts. With a career situated neatly between Dwight Moody's and Billy Sunday's, J. Wilber Chapman was the Presbyterians' own celebrity evangelist. Quite unlike Billy Sunday, who, by the way, trained under him, Chapman didn't go out for homiletical athleticism. According to one person who heard him preach, Chapman was very quiet and sincere, never clownish. Quote, "If he studied the art of making impressions, it was nowhere apparent." I like that description. Chapman exuded masculinity of a different sort. Dignified and well-dressed, Chapman aimed for the middle-class businessman. He held revival meetings in the midst of the workday in the heart of the business district, and men would flock from their offices to hear a preacher who spoke their language. In 1909, Chapman held a massive campaign in the city of Boston and surrounding areas. It's possible that 750,000 people participated in this regional revival. Crowds were so large that Chapman actually discouraged attendance by those he considered least likely to benefit, that is, by women. Some meetings were for men only, and that policy was enforced. But even at mixed-sex services, women were often made to feel auxiliary to the purposes of the gathering. When women were mentioned in Chapman's sermons, it was often to exhort them to act as leverage against their husbands and sons, to get them to church. In the Boston campaign, Chapman included in his entourage one Virginia Asher to sing, pray, and roam the halls of the venue in search of lost men, serving for the campaign, Bendroth argues, as a kind of professional mother. So these were some of the cards in play as Presbyterians approached the turn of the century. A denomination that eagerly sought a place in the center of the culture, a missionary apparatus that made significant space for women, a theology hardened against the kind of scriptural interpretation that encouraged women's religious leadership, and evangelistic strategies that increasingly chased middle-class businessmen who were assumed to be on the leading edge of the culture and in far orbit from the church. This all came to a head in the years surrounding the First World War. Like many American Protestants, Presbyterians came to see the war as the chance for a fresh start, an opportunity to bring disparate forces into alliance and set them marching in coordinated effort. Superabundant to all the other forces pressing Americans toward more masculine religion, the Great War added a kind of martial ethos that few made any serious effort to resist. Indeed, Presbyterians were keen to mirror the militancy of a society at war and use its tools for their own purposes. At a denominational level, those purposes were expressed in a vast reform program known as the New Era Movement, a series of initiatives designed to retrofit the church for the 20th century. These included expanding and improving national fundraising, streamlining the bureaucracy by hacking through that forest of Presbyterian boards and agencies, emulating corporate practices by pushing into advertising and journalistic media, and strengthening ties to business and political leaders. Denominational officials spoke of the movement in literally messianic terms as, quote, "the greatest day the world has known since the shepherds looked into the face of the babe in the manger," end quote. This program of institutional modernization and similar ones in other denominations signaled the arrival of the type of American Protestantism that we call mainline. Those large, nationally integrated, theologically inclusive denominations that came to dominate the American religious scene by the 1950s. As Presbyterians were remaking themselves in this hyper-masculine moment through the New Era movement, it's interesting to notice what levers they instinctively reached for. There were, of course, ready metaphors in the war itself. As soldiers in the American Expeditionary Force sacrificed themselves for worldwide democracy, so individual givers, or congregations, or the denomination as a whole, laid down available resources for God's work in the world. As previously distrustful nations allied to defeat the Kaiser, so squabbling benevolent boards and missionary agencies would federate for the common good, while maintaining their independent prerogatives and identities. Presbyterians structured their fundraising around re-enlistment days, on which the church would close ranks behind their divine commander-in-chief. Sometimes these comparisons produce more than metaphors. To sell war bonds, the Wilson administration recruited thousands of volunteer speechmakers called 4-minute men to give short promotional speeches in theaters, churches, and other public venues. Needing a little extra time, I suppose, to explain the ins and outs of denominational funding, the New Era movement trained 10-minute men to promote their Victory Fund campaign. In addition to emulating the war effort, the New Era movement looked aspirationally toward the worlds of business and industry. A series of long articles in the New Era magazine cast the church as the biggest business in the world, with congregations as little life factories that took raw material, just plain folk, and turned them into finished products. Pastors were superintendents, individual donors were stockholders, and denominational bureaucrats were, well, bureaucrats. The denomination founded a much-hyped layman's council, not for any apparent administrative purpose, but in order to attach themselves publicly to prominent businessmen. The New Era made much of their department of publicity, which distilled and distributed the wisdom of an emerging guild of corporate ad men. Presbyterians gazed longingly at a professional, corporatizing culture, projecting themselves as the chief business, the chief promoters, in a male world of businesses and promoters. To bridge that divide, they recruited as vice chair none other than J. Wilber Chapman, the very picture of the kind of Christian that New Era leaders wanted to produce. Entrepreneurial and virile, but also respectable, possessing a mind for business, but centered in warmly evangelical faith. I could go on in this vein, but you might already be seeing that Presbyterian engagement with what I've been describing as the masculine moment was kind of overdetermined. Presbyterians were trying to rationalize denominational structures at a time when rationality attached strongly to men. They were engaged in theological struggle over new biblical tools, especially favored by women. They were overhauling their evangelism to target managers in suits. They were swept up in wartime enthusiasm, drawing inspiration from soldiers and the Wilsonian government. They were swept up in corporatizing enthusiasm, drawing inspiration from ad men and boards of trustees. So what was the result of all this? How did the masculine wave change the Northern Presbyterian Church? Among the main part of the denomination, those who held together through the disruptions and schisms of the 1920s and 30s, one might say that masculine Presbyterianism, despite its overwhelming prominence in the interwar period, was finally rebuffed. The high point of the New Era narrative was a dramatic reconfiguration of the board structure passed by the General Assembly in 1923. Spearheaded by John Timothy Stone, the longtime chair of the denomination's Committee on Men's Work, the so-called Stone Plan sounded the bell of businesslike rationality, took the many-armed Presbyterian bureaucracy and reduced it to 5 superboards. In that process, the women's boards of missions were eliminated, their work folded into the new structure. This moment, when the Stone Plan swept away decades of women's independent leadership, is a fitting climax to our Presbyterian story. It achieved the denomination's most cherished masculinizing goals, chief among them to conform their church to a corporate model. It's an even more satisfying climax, though, because on the gender question, it was so easily and thoroughly turned back. The plan produced a revolt. The General Assembly appointed a commission to study the causes of unrest among women in the church. Published in 1927, the resulting report led directly to a new push for women's ordination, first as deacons, then as elders, and finally as ministers of word and sacrament. Women's success in defending their leadership in the 1920s depended almost certainly on their track record. They had constructed a missionary and benevolent apparatus and financing attached to it that the church couldn't afford to lose. At a meeting of the women's leadership, one delegate put it memorably, quote, "This whole question seems to be about church dollars and politics. We are still in a position where if we cannot be loved, we must be respected." This church, which would become the modern PCUSA, came to take very principled stands on women's leadership. It's interesting to think, though, that those early steps in the 1920s were made because Presbyterian women had the male executive leadership over a barrel. But this wasn't the only group of Northern Presbyterians that would march forward into the 20th century. This was, of course, the period of the fundamentalist modernist controversies, and Presbyterians fought one of the hottest battles. When J. Gresham Machen took steps to separate from the main body of the church, he did so because of issues with strong gender valences. In 1929, when he departed Princeton to found Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia, he was choosing the strict biblicism of Hodge and Warfield over against more historical readings that made space for women's leadership. In 1933, when he went around the denomination to establish his own independent missions board, he was repudiating what he saw as the creeping liberalism of Presbyterians' existing missionary structures, a liberalism carried, in Machen's mind and many others, by theologically uncommitted women. In 1936, when he broke with the denomination entirely to found the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, he demonstrated a willingness to burn bridges and erect wholly new structures that contrasted sharply with the pragmatic institutionalism of the main Presbyterian body. And indeed, as the Orthodox Presbyterians and other conservative splinter churches went forward, they would cling to the theology of old Princeton, preserve a wholly male pastorate, retain a narrow view of missionary work, and display a theological combativeness, all features endemic to the masculine Christianity of the early 20th century. This pattern, mainline bodies gradually finding institutional ways to honor a burgeoning female religiosity, while separating fundamentalists doubled down on male religious order and control. This pattern was repeated in most of the Protestant denominations that divided in the upheavals of the 1920s and 30s. Indeed, historians of gender and American religion have argued, quite plausibly, I think, that re-masculinized Christianity, with its concerns for aggressive defense of theology and practice, became a defining feature of 20th century fundamentalism and, to an extent, evangelicalism. That concerns about gender weren't incidental to that tradition, but right at its very heart. It was in these conservative churches that the Victorian view of women as saints was most thoroughly repudiated, in fact, reversed, making women into agents of theological and cultural disorder. So what should we say about all this? Why should we care? It's possible, I suppose, that someone here is eager to trace the intricacies of Presbyterian institutionalization, to observe the methods and costs of early mainline consolidation, and to ponder how, a century later, Presbyterians and other mainliners are dealing with the erosion of these consolidated models. If that's you, fantastic. Talk to me afterward. Maybe a few more of us are interested in the difference between mainline and fundamentalist responses to a re-masculinized Christianity, especially since Westmont College is descended from that family of American Protestants who placed gender deliberately at the center of their religious project. If that's you, run, don't walk to pick up Peggy Bendroth's Fundamentalism and Gender. If you've had the nagging feeling that evangelicals talk an awful lot about men and women, but you haven't been able to put your finger on why, this concise little book will change your life. But the message I think we can all hear is a lot more general. Much of what Christian historians do is to observe a development in culture or politics or the economy, and then watch how it bounces around in the church's pipes. The universal lesson of that practice, one that I've sometimes thought we should repeat to ourselves as a kind of church historical liturgy, is that fewer things are native to our faith than we suppose. Beliefs and practices that we accept as natural or even necessary come to us not through some hermetic theological ecclesial process, but through the subtle alchemies of a culturally embedded religious tradition. In the case before us, contingencies of economic change, geopolitics, and elite anxiety cultivated masculine religious energies starting in the late 19th century. That conservative Protestants especially have continued to cultivate them has to do with further accidents of urbanization, scientific and theological ferment, and denominational infighting. Mainline Protestant rejection of this masculine Christianity, as in the Presbyterian case, was an outgrowth of the desire to keep denominational ships afloat, to retain the resources of the women, whose funds, expertise, and infrastructure were in turn made possible by economically initiated Victorian-era relationships between factories and middle-class homes and wives and children and saloons and fathers and laborers. This is not to denigrate those features of Christian tradition that have washed in on the cultural tide. But it should remind us, as Andrew Walls says, that every Christianity is Christianity in translation, mediated through real human cultures and lives. And it should encourage us, as we live our own translated faith, to appreciate what truths we have, even as we seek the truths we might be missing, in the faith and experiences of men or women or anyone else whose Christianity is incarnated differently from our own. Thank you.
So we started with an image of Jesus as a boxer, and you talked a bit about the need to recognize Jesus as the carpenter who worked with his hands and did things and didn't just sit around and talk theology. Are there other ways that the way the church imagined Jesus and thought of Jesus shifted through this remasculinization process?
That is a great question, to which I do not have any great answer, and maybe no particular answer at all. It is interesting, though, the ways that people's perceptions of Jesus and perceptions of themselves sort of get projected onto the church that they construct and the work that they do. And I wonder how much of that is kind of retroactive. Once you are already engaged in the work, you bring Jesus alongside you in the guise of a carpenter or a boxer or whatever else. I tend to think that that is probably kind of the pattern. It's hard to imagine that that's not the pattern in that picture of Jesus as pugilist, yes. Right? Somebody has that image in their head as a particularly Christian masculine image and, slaps Jesus' face on it. Or Michael W. Smith's face is sort of how I read that image, if anybody knows his.
Is that a culture wars image, Jesus as the boxer?
I don't know much about the artist who painted that. I considered giving you a few more images of his. His name is Stephen Sawyer, and I think he's still alive. You can still buy his prints on his website, and many of them are sort of in this vein. There's a whole series of boxer portraits of Jesus. There are some more with Jesus doing other kinds of unexpected things, shall we say. Standing behind a firefighter, kind of holding the hose behind the guy. There's one with a drug addict shooting up, and Jesus behind him, like trying to physically restrain him from doing it. So some of them, it's hard to sort of balance the roughness of the imagery against the goofiness of the imagery. I'm not exactly sure how to read those images. I understand, though, that they resonate quite strongly with some people. As I was designing the poster for this talk and thinking the better on Parents' Weekend of using Jesus as boxer, Dr. Reeder sent me an article from the New York Times that had been published that very day, so it was profiling a bunch of younger evangelicals and talking about their sense of politics especially. But one of the portraits of the young evangelical men that they were profiling had him in his house with one of those Stephen Sawyer paintings, quite unironically, I think, on the wall behind him. So I felt a little chastised, I think, in that. Some people make a lot of genuine meaning out of those images. Yeah?
Thank you very much, Dr. Sizer, a very interesting lecture. So it's actually hard not to compare what went on then and even now, a century later, with the nativism, with a lot of changes and rhetorics of immigrants, and then divisions, and then it was a fundamentalist modernist controversy, but now also still the liberal conservative, including also the cultural wars. What, as you see, now through the lens of the history, then what kind of masculinity do you see in the churches now emerging?
I think you're right. I think in a lot of ways it feels like the same masculinity, fueled by the same things. And that makes sense in historical perspective. I mean, we're talking about the end of an economic arc that puts the elites in American society in a very different working space from everybody else who increasingly look not like them. And 100 years ago, that was physically situated in American cities. Now it's kind of physically separated between North America and the rest of the world that does that kind of manufacturing and work. But increasingly, those people and those cultures are sort of washing back ashore, in a sense. And it feels very much the same to me. Once you are no longer rooted in the work that gives your masculinity meaning, it just sort of goes floating around all over the place. And you have to search for, as we see in the Huckberry website, I think, you have to go searching for the nearest metaphors, the nearest images, the sort of closest thing you can think of that will reattach you to something that feels like authentic masculinity. And interestingly, I wonder if even in something as kind of urbane and pricey and upper middle class as that website, there aren't kind of uncomfortable racial dynamics as well. And there's something that feels just extremely powerfully white to me about all of the imagery on that site, and especially having to do now with leisure too, and not simply work, the kind of leisure that white upper middle class American families are engaged in, which again has resonances in the early part of the 20th century. So historians are trained to never make generalizations across large periods of time. So I would back off from any direct sort of comparison here. But yeah, isn't it interesting that all of these ingredients still seem to be in play 100 years later?